Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Trav McLeod. I'm the Executive Director of the Brotherhood of St Laurence, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and continuing custodians of the lands we're meeting on this morning, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and paying our respects to elders past and present. I'm delighted that the Brotherhood of St Laurence and the University of Melbourne, the two partners in today's launch, have affirmed their support for the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the importance of a yes vote in the forthcoming referendum. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank all First Nation staff and volunteers from both organisations. So we're here to launch a new report from the Brotherhood of St Laurence and the Life Call Centre. The report is hot off the press and it's called Enabling Electrification, Addressing the Barriers to Moving Off Gas Faced by Lower Income Households. It's a timely report as winter bites and households are struggling with energy costs and as we see climate impacts becoming even more apparent. We've seen that in recent weeks, particularly with the heat waves in Southern Europe, in China, Middle East and North America. Just last week, the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported that last month was the planet's warmest June since global temperature record keeping started in 1850. To that end, it's terrific we have Minister Lily D'Ambrosio with us today to launch the report. Minister D'Ambrosio and the Victorian Government have made climate action a priority. Minister, welcome, and thank you for your leadership and the Victorian Government's leadership on climate action and particularly on the transition away from gas. I'd also like to welcome our colleagues from the University of Melbourne, particularly Professor Abigail Payne, the Director of the Melbourne Institute, who will chair the second half of this event. So we all know the transition away from traditional fuels, including gas, is key to reducing the impacts of climate change and to meeting our net zero targets. It can make an enormous difference to households which are struggling with energy affordability and energy efficiency. We know household gas prices have been rising quite dramatically, up by over 40% in the year to January 2023. And we know that good electric heating is 3 to 5 times more energy efficient than gas. Australia can't do its fair share to address climate change and meet our commitments without reducing our dependency on gas. And this is particularly difficult for households facing disadvantage, for lower income households to do. Those households are likely to be hardest impacted by climate impacts and will find the transition away from traditional fuels most difficult. And that's what this report is all about. Today's event will run in 2 parts. In a moment, we'll hear from Minister D'Ambrosio, who'll say a few words about gas and electrification. And following the Minister, we'll hear very briefly a video from some of our participants to talk about the issues raised in the report. And then we'll hear from the lead author of the report, Sangeetha Chandrasekharan, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Life Call Centre, who will introduce the research. She'll speak about the report, which has been done with her co-authors, Julia De Bruin, David Bryant and Damien Sullivan. We'll then hear from Damien Sullivan, who's Acting Director of VSL's Social Policy and Research Centre, about some of the policy implications from the research too. And in the second half of the event, I'll hand over to Professor Payne, who will do a deeper dive into the research and answer questions from you, which she'll field to the panel. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Minister D'Ambrosio, Victorian Minister for Climate Action, Minister for Energy and Resources and Minister for the State Electricity Commission. Thank you, Minister.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you very much, Trace, for your welcome. And I'd like to begin by my own acknowledgement of the traditional owners of this land, and they are the people of Wurundjeri. And my respects go to all of their elders of the past, the present, the emerging, and of course, any who may be here amongst us today. I'd like to also acknowledge Professor Abigail Payne and Dr. Sangeetha Chandrasekharan. Very pleased to meet you both. and other authors who've also here today. I also want to lend my voice to acknowledgement of the importance of voice referendum, and however people vote, it is an important thing that people participate in, and I will personally be voting yes. But also our government is, as a state level, is very committed to forming treaties with our traditional communities here in Victoria, and we're on the way to doing that. I'm very much jumped at the opportunity to speak today on enabling electrification, this really terrific document that goes some way, quite a good way, to explaining the importance of electrification and decarbonising our gas use, especially at the domestic level, at the housing level, but also unpicking for all of us what are the opportunities, and in that we can see that there are many barriers for particular members of our community to be able to come along, if you like, for the journey as we decarbonise our energy system. And we know that gas is a big challenge, bigger than electricity in some ways, although with electricity we have solutions, we have support programs in place targeting communities who, and some of those communities are those that can least afford the upfront costs, if you like, of decarbonisation. However, these things are always much more complex than what we set out to achieve, and when we set out first to understand the challenge. But wherever there are those challenges and barriers, it's incumbent on organisations such as the Brotherhood of St. Laurence and other social support services, and of course governments of all persuasions, it's incumbent on all of us to look for ways that we can assist in mitigating barriers or remove them altogether if we can. And that is really important for us, because we know, of course, that globally, as the world understands it better and seeing the tangible impacts of climate, and Travis talked about some of those, and they're not going away, they're only going to get worse. I think it is now in very stark focus that those communities that are less resilient in terms of their own abilities to be able to mitigate or the risks, if you like, are very much at the forefront of the impacts of climate change. We know, of course, in a country like Australia that has very severe heat waves, we know what that can lead to in terms of heat stress in the home, increased deaths in the home because of it. We know, and it's often referred to, that when we had the Black Saturday bushfires back in 2009, that more people died from heat stress in the home than in the fires. And people lost in the fires were quite significant. But this tells you, in particular, what we're facing really every summer, almost every summer. And we know that devastating storms also have, and floods also have an ongoing impact on communities. And we only have to look to communities in regional Victoria to see that many of them are still suffering, if you like, in terms of dislocation, homelessness in those communities, even more than a year since the last floods. So why is this report important? Well, it actually helps governments focus our minds to why electrify. And why we electrify is really important, but so is how we electrify. And the report, of course, makes it clear that there are a number of barriers that governments need to consider. One is that I think is an issue for every member of the community, regardless of their means, to be able to take solutions or buy solutions for themselves, and that is the broad awareness of the benefits of electrification and moving away from use of gas in the home. So more education is obviously very important. But can I say to you that this document itself and the video we're about to see is all part of that education piece. But of course, more needs to be done to give people the right information so that they can make the right choices for themselves. Money, of course, is always an issue, especially when we talk about electrification that requires an upfront cost to swapping out an old heating system, for example, that may be terribly inefficient, is run on gas, the quality of the air in a home, especially when we're all trying to rug up and keep warm in the winter period, has a lot of health impacts. But finding the money for that upfront cost of putting in something that is far more efficient and healthier for us and saves you, though, on your bills every year, that is a barrier that we acknowledge. Not owning a home is one that is becoming a bigger barrier, as we all know, and that is a focus of the Victorian government's commitment to releasing a housing strategy in the coming period of time and not too far away. And this document here, the work that the Brotherhood has done, will be an important input to a range of considerations that are underway within government about how we can address some of these barriers. I'm not here to make any announcements. That's not for me to be able to do just yet, but certainly I can assure you that through the housing strategy, plus the work that I am doing in terms of our gas substitution roadmap, which is a bit of a clunky name, it's not very sexy, but it is what it says it is. It's about how do we take away fossil gas and substitute it. And the biggest area for that in terms of substitution is electrification, so electrical appliances, but also energy efficiency in the home, which is really critical. I will be releasing an update to that substitution roadmap later this year. And we'll have more to say about the steps that we'll be taking to help communities, individuals to be able to come along for the journey and in terms of that electrification. Certainly, I know that if we look at one particular program that has been very successful in helping low-income families, and that has been the Solar Homes program, where whilst the eligibility to access that program is quite broad, I know for a fact through the data that we collect that the majority of people who access that program are earning less than $1,000 a year. So it tells you that it's working in terms of people finding it an easy program to access, which is really good, and they start to save dollars from day one with that upfront cost of the grant, but also the no interest loan component is working quite well. Obviously, the hard nut to crack has always been how do you get solar in homes where people are renting. We've tried to design a program that improves the uptake and accessibility of solar for rental properties. There's more work that we need to do to try to really drive that program to be more successful. No one's been able to crack that nut yet, but that doesn't mean that we don't keep working on it, and we'll continue to do that. So can I just, with those words, I really want to commend the Brotherhood of St. Laurence for the really practical work that you always do. You always do. You for governments, understanding what the problems are is really important, and hearing that from organisations that is well regarded, well respected and trusted, which is the Brotherhood of St. Laurence, that information coming through to government is really, really precious. What's even better is when some solutions are brought forward to us too, and because there will be different solutions depending on what the problem is that you're trying to fix and who you're trying to help. And so you'll get different answers or different recommendations from different communities. But I know that the Brotherhood of St. Laurence has always got those most vulnerable, the lowest income families and individuals as part of the thinking or the focus or the frame through which solutions are brought forward. So thank you so much for that. I've said too much already. Can I thank you very much for the report, and in particular, I'm really pleased that you've asked me to come and help to launch this. So congratulations to all of you. Best wishes.
I'm Deb, Melbournian born and bred. I have been a homeowner, a landlord. I am now a renter. Mentioned. I've lived my whole life with gas appliances, with ducted heating, gas cooking, gas hot water. In the late 70s, there was a huge push to go from electrification to gas because gas is very cheaper. I'm now trying to electrify my home to get in with that gas bill. It's been a very steep learning curve, I'll be honest with you.
My name is Susana. I was born in Uruguay and I have been in Australia for 2/3 of my life. I have both gas and electricity at home. Years ago, gas, it was really good because it was cheaper and it's a very efficient way of cooking and heating the house. However, lately it's been really very hard to afford to use gas. Also, I'm very conscientious about the environment, so I'm keen to get rid of all the gas appliances. So it's been hard, and now electricity and gas are going up by horrendous percentage. I don't know how people are going to manage that.
I live with my son. My son and I have stopped using the gas ducted heating. We have purchased portable heaters for the bedrooms and we're using a split system in the lounge room. Unfortunately, we live in a very old house, about 60 years old, which was insulated and a lot of gas, a lot of drafts. So we're doing our best with rugs and draft stoppers and everything, and trying desperately not to use the gas. No, I don't feel that we're able to afford the energy we need for heating the house.
At the moment, I don't think I can afford to heat the house like I used to. Right this week, I've been using a bit more gas central heating because I just came out of hospital from having surgery. Bone surgery is very painful. So if I'm cold, I get very, very sore, but I'm already ready what the next bill is going to be. I have to think hard, and I have to consider if I can afford to turn the heater on or not, which is really sad. I buy my own house, not paid for yet, but it's my own house. So I don't know how people rent, and they've been put up the rent so much, are going to be able to afford gas and electricity.
Comparing June's bill with 12 months ago, the gas has gone up $60 per month in one jump, and that is before the 25% increase that we're expecting this month. My reaction was to contact the utility company and apply for a payment plan. But this is not just a renter thing, this is across the board. But I think the government needs to step in and cap these prices. People are going to freeze to death this week. They can't afford jobs like this.
Sangeeta Chandrasekharan from the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for Children and Families over the Life course. Minister D'Ambrosio, thank you so much for launching this report, and Travis, thanks very much for the introduction. I too want to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the traditional custodians, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging leaders. I really want to thank the research participants for their honesty and generosity and time for participating in this really important research. And you've seen a small snapshot of the rich insights that they provided to us. Thanks to the Brotherhood of St. Laurence for engaging in this very important applied research partnership. And I just wanted to mention Julia De Bruin, who was a co-author and did a lot of the research on this and is now based overseas. From an energy affordability perspective, the decision to electrify makes a lot of sense, and modelling shows that there are significant savings if you move off gas to electricity, and particularly if you install solar. And the households who need those savings most are the lowest income households. But we know that as more and more households who are able leave the gas network, fewer households are left to pay the fixed network costs, and those who remain will have to pay more. And without policy action, this is likely to be those on lower incomes and those facing disadvantage. Journeys to electrify are not straightforward, and any of you who have embarked on the process will know this. It involves planning, searching for information, seeking out trusted advice when there's a lot of information and data coming at you. There's uncertainty, there's risk. You have to engage and adapt with your existing home. You have to have conversations with tradies and retailers, government agencies, landlords, and your neighbours. And of course, you have to find the money to upgrade the appliance or install solar. We wanted to understand what these journeys look like for lower income households and what can be done to enable these journeys. So thanks to our research partnership with the Brotherhood and the trusted relationships that they have in the community, we were able to survey over 220 lower income households and have in-depth conversations with 34. Almost 9 out of 10 had an equivalized income of less than $40,000 per year. 9 out of 10 relied on income support. 6 out of 10 were in financial stress. 6 out of 10 were unable to heat their home or went without meals or couldn't pay essential bills in the last 12 months. Half of our sample were renters, and that includes private renters and social housing. Importantly, support for a transition away from gas towards clean energy was very strong amongst our sample. Half strongly supported the transition and 2/3 showed some kind of support. However, only about 1 out of 10 had actually switched from gas to electric appliances in the last 5 years. And they were driven to do this mainly by the cost savings and the environmental benefits. The main challenges to electrifying were, of course, the upfront costs. And for renters, the challenges were that they had little say over the decisions, nor could they see themselves capturing the full benefits because they didn't have security of tenure. There was a preference for gas for cooking, but we noted that this was strongly linked to existing usage. So this suggests that shifting to electric appliances could actually lower attachment to gas. When we asked about the benefits of gas over electric appliances, we observed a relatively high level of uncertainty and some misunderstanding about the benefits. For example, 28% thought electric appliances had lower running costs. The rest thought gas was cheaper or the same, or they didn't know. Electricity was seen to be much better for the environment and safer than gas, but gas was thought to perform better. So there's a real opportunity here to enhance motivation for electrification through better evidence-based communications, as the Minister has mentioned. But better quality information is important, but not enough. Our participants told us that how the information is delivered is critically important. Trusted sources of information are more likely to be from language or ethnic community groups, from local government, from neighbourhood houses, and from organisations like the Brotherhood. When it came to existing support programs, we found much greater awareness and uptake of supports for energy bills, such as the power saving bonus, as opposed to the actual programs to electrify. Only 1 in 3 had heard of the home heating and cooling program and the Victorian Energy Upgrades program, and even less had taken it up. Awareness of Solar Homes program was almost twice as high as awareness of the electrification program. Our sample said they wanted more support for energy costs and energy efficiency improvements. They wanted to see more landlord upgrades to appliances. Overall, our research showed that there is no typical low-income household, but there are shared challenges. Based on the focus groups, we believe there is a group amongst low-income households who are willing and able to electrify, and they tend to be older homeowners who are environmentally motivated and have some savings. There's another group willing but unable to electrify, and they too are environmentally motivated, but they're really struggling with energy costs and they're more likely to be renters. They also have a lack of trust in mainstream information and service providers. There are also those who are neither willing nor able, and they're more likely to be renters experiencing energy hardship and other forms of poverty-related stress. We provide in this report a number of detailed customer journeys showing the enablers and the barriers for electrification for some of our focus group participants. We hope that the energy and housing sectors will look at these carefully to understand the nuances of the challenges that lower income households face and develop effective responses. I'll now let Damien speak more about the implications of the research. Suffice to say that there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be done. our households told us very clearly they wanted tailored, trusted and timely advice, and they need support to go all electric. They also want their voices heard in the planning process. Thank you.
Thanks, Sangeeta. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country upon which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to elders past and present. And it's a pleasure to be here with Minister D'Ambrosio, who's played such a leadership role in climate change, energy affordability and electrification here in Victoria, which we know will lower bills and reduce carbon pollution. We initiated this research at the Brotherhood of St Laurence to better understand the aspirations and needs of lower income households in relation to electrification. We continue to be concerned that lower income households, if they're not supported to get off gas, will be the last ones left on the network, paying higher costs and missing out on the savings that we know are there from electrification. It was a really good process to be involved in, talking to people the Brotherhood of St Laurence has worked with over the past 7 to 8 years in different programs like Deb and Susanna, who we just heard in the video. But it was also challenging at times to hear the precarious nature of people's housing situation, the struggle for warmth and the measures people would go to stay warm. And one of the ones that certainly struck in our minds was somebody who would sleep with their dogs at night to stay warm through the night. And people will go to any extent to stay warm themselves, but also to keep their kids warm as well, which people often struggle to do. I'll go into more detail in the policy implications in the second half, but just to foreshadow some that came through that have been mentioned by Minister D'Ambrosio and Sangeeta as well. The need for reliable, trusted information. And it came through directly the idea of a one-stop shop and potentially the role that the SEC could play as it did previously, and the new SEC could play as well, State Electricity Commission. Ensuring co-design, particularly with people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds and people with diverse needs. More training for tradespeople, like is already taking place in Victoria with the Climate Action Centre for plumbers. The need to address the perceived risks, and particularly understand the value and reliability of electric appliances. But also addressing the uncertainty people face of not really knowing if this shift is really going to happen. So a really clear plan, as Minister D'Ambrosio has been leading on. People also mentioned the need for financial support to transition their homes to electric homes, like the Solar Victoria grants, but across a broader sweep of appliances. And potentially no interest loans in some cases as well. As has been mentioned previously, tenure came through in a really big way, and the challenges renters face was a really big issue, and how we address that challenge is going to be critical. And finally, as Sangeeta mentioned, ensuring the planning processes are inclusive and government plays a leadership role in making those processes inclusive for all. Electrification really is a critical opportunity to lower people's bills and address carbon pollution. So let's do it right and make sure all households can be involved in it and get the benefits from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. Can I just ask you, are there any media present? Just give you an opportunity to ask questions before the Minister needs to leave us. No? Okay. Well, look, thank you, Sangeeta, thank you, Damien, and thank you, Minister. Sangeeta, as you said, journeys to electrification are not straightforward. They can be precarious, which is why it was terrific to hear the Minister say that this report, Enabling Electrification, will really focus minds on why electrify and how to electrify. And in your words, Damien, how in particular to provide the capacity, information and resources in a trusted way to enable lower income households to electrify and live the lives that they aspire to. And it's great to know, Minister, that this will be a very useful input into the housing strategy and also the update to the gas substitution roadmap later this year. I'll hand over to Professor Abigail Payne, but can we please thank the Minister for being with us today? Oh, of course, we need a
Want to
photo.
jump in? Sorry.
Copy of the report. Perfect. Why don't we go in front? I've already answered.
Okay, ready? 1, 2. Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this second part to this launch. I'm Abigail Payne. I am Director of the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research at the University of Melbourne. I too would like to pay my respects to the lands, to the elders for the lands in which we are here today, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the nation. And for those of you online, I pay my respects to the elders in places where you are. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. So as the director of the Melbourne Institute, we've been around for 60 years and we were started under the inaugural director of Ronald Henderson. So for those of you who've heard of the Henderson, the poverty line is named after Ronald Henderson. So embedded into our DNA is a notion of how do we inform and shape economic and social policy around poverty, be it income poverty, economic disadvantage, or social disadvantage. So it is a pleasure to be a part of this launch, and I commend the authors for their hard work. And I'm looking forward to the next little time with you, as well as those of you online, as for a robust discussion of the report, the findings, and where do we take this. So it's not just simply stopping with the release of the report, but how do we engage in action? So before I continue, there is another video that we're going to watch. So I will come back to you in a second.
As a child growing up, my grandfather and 2 uncles worked for the old SEC down in Sport. The SEC would offer, I believe there was subsidised appliances where you could buy them very cheaply and you could pay them off either with no interest or very low interest. Something like that would be extremely helpful for low, or for everybody, not just low income, for everybody to electrify, so that we can go out and buy the cooktops and buy the solar panels and all the rest of it without this huge impost.
I think subsidizing appliances for low income people will be fantastic. I think the more the government does in subsidizing all these changes, the better off it's going to be, because even if somebody doesn't care much about the environment, everybody cares about being able to afford the one and have that family living in a warm house. So I think the more schemes like this that the government provides, the more people will change to electricity.
I really think they need to start offering either low interest or no interest loans so that people can electrify. Most of us want to electrify, we want to cut our bills, we want to help the environment. We can't afford it, it's as simple as that. As a renter, it's more difficult to replace appliances because you need to get approval through the real estate agent. It's a lot easier as a homeowner, obviously, because you can just make a decision, go and purchase what you want. I do find it difficult to find a meeting ground between myself and the landlord as to what would be an efficient and cost-effective appliance. There is so many houses out there that are uninsulated, have ancient antiquated appliances, and there's no rules or regulations to state that landlords have to come in and bring it up to a certain standard, and it needs to be. Landlords will go to the lowest common denominator if they need to replace appliances. They're not going to go for the most efficient until such time as we have some sort of regulation across the industry. As a retro, I absolutely support the minimum standards.
I will support the scheme that the government will have a minimum requirement of heating for the rental people, and also that they have a subsidy for the owners to change to electrical. And I think it's shameful to find out that some people who are renting and paying a lot of money, but they don't even have a proper heating.
I feel like the government should be supplying some sort of trustworthy advice, some website, something similar to Choice, but that we don't need to pay for because people can't afford to pay to get the advice.
I think getting advice directly from third party is extremely important. It will be very, very helpful because I get a bit insecure because everybody presents the product differently. It's not a matter of reading, it's just that you don't know what to read. It's going to the mechanic and he tells you you have to do this, that, and the other, but you don't know what they're talking about. So if you don't know what they're talking about, you can't make a good choice or trust the choice you make.
I would be concerned for people that, for instance, if my parents need to look into it, I don't think they'd be capable of doing it.
But if it was a website that you can go and you know it's from the government and you know nobody, you have any financial interest in your decision and they're giving you a good explanation, that's very, very important. And the only way is for a lot of information to be available, people explaining the straight connection between gas and environment and how it works. And telling people that if you change, not only you're going to be helping the environment, but you're going to be helping yourself because you're going to pay less.
Great. So next we have two presentations, and then during those presentations, I hope you're forming your questions because we will be, after the presentations, will be followed by a Q&A. So first up is Dr. Sangeeta Chandrasekaran, who is my colleague at University of Melbourne and with Life Course Center. She's going to speak for about 10 minutes to take us through some of the findings of the report. And then immediately following her, Damien Sullivan from the Brotherhood of St. Laurence will be speaking to the policy implications.
Thanks very much, Abigail. I've covered some of the highlights from the report earlier, but I'll be showing you quite a few slides and going into a bit more detail now. Just to begin by saying thanks and acknowledging that this was funded by Energy Consumers Australia. We also had additional financial support from the Melbourne Energy Institute, which is based at this university. And our work was supported by the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence that I mentioned, which is focused on addressing intergenerational disadvantage over the life course. I once again want to mention Julia de Bruyn's contribution in the research, and also David Bryant is behind this column. He was also a co-author and played a really important point. It was a good team effort. Australian states are recognising the need to transition away from gas and to go all electric. Victoria and the ACT are leading the way here, and this is occurring against a backdrop of rising energy prices, cost of living pressures, and housing insecurity. Gas makes up a significant proportion of household energy consumption, And gas consumption itself contributes to around 17% of this state's greenhouse gas emissions. And you probably know that Victoria has the highest residential gas use in the country, and it's even higher in metro compared to regional areas. So electrification presents these upfront costs for new appliances, such as solar panels, new heating systems. But for those willing and able to do this, they can make savings. And this is modelling from the Victorian government done last year. And I think it would look even more favourable given the gas price rises that we've seen since this was done. And as I mentioned and Damien mentioned, there's a real risk that those who can't afford to go off gas will be stranded on the network and pay higher costs. So we really need policy action here to address the inequity. This research sought to understand better what lower income households thought about a transition away from gas and the barriers they face in electrifying their homes. The research looked at the adequacy of existing supports to electrify, and we asked what supports would help accelerate electrification. Generally, there's been insufficient research on the equity implications of the transition and the barriers that lower income households face. So there's been good work done by Infrastructure Victoria and the Department of Environment, and they produced findings that were representative of Victoria's population by age, gender, and location. They both did surveys. So we took a slightly different approach. We used purposive sampling and mixed methods. And we did this to be able to provide additional insights into the perspectives of lower income households. We couldn't have done this research without the partnership with Brotherhood of St. Laurence, who have an extraordinary reputation and trust in the community, and were able to recruit from their significant database, and also to be there to provide follow-up support. And a lot of the people we spoke to came back with more and more questions. And you could really see in the focus group discussions that we did, people shifting in the hour or so that we spoke to them, from saying, this is not important and I can't do this, to this is important and I want to do this, and asking Damien, how can I do this? So we recruited people who fell within this category of lower income. The Australian Bureau of Statistics defines low income households as those in the lowest income quintile, $580 per week or $30,000 annually. But we didn't want to apply a really strict inclusion, just change slides. We didn't want to apply this inclusion criteria too strictly, because we know that people face barriers to switching and also experiencing energy vulnerability based not just on income, but on a range of household characteristics. Disability is one, caring responsibilities, and health problems, as we saw with Susanna. We did exclude respondents with an equivalized annual income over $60,000, and others were excluded on a wider assessment of financial position. For example, low financial stress, owning your home outright. 1/3 of our sample had an annual income of less than $20,000, and 86% had an income of less than $40,000 per year. And as I mentioned, 9 out of 10 were on income support. The survey asked about household energy use, energy practices, financial stress and energy hardship, their history of changing gas appliances, their support for a transition away from gas, and the motivations and barriers to switching, and the assistance that they see is necessary to enable them to switch. In this report, we are reporting on statistically significant intergroup differences in experiences, in attitudes, beliefs, according to both individual and household characteristics. And we followed the survey with focus group discussions to delve deeper into the challenges that these households face, the lived experience, and we did these both in Metro Melbourne and online. So as you can see from this data-heavy slide, our sample skewed to older respondents. We had a reasonable mix of tenure, so close to half of our survey respondents lived in their own home. 31% owned their own home outright, and they tended to be older people. 17% were paying a mortgage, and half were renters, both social housing and private renters. About 1/3 of our sample were living with children, and of that group, half were single parents. More than 1/4 were caring, identified caring as their main activity. 1/4 spoke a language other than English at home. And then we asked a series of questions about financial stress. And we compared this to the nationally representative HILDA sample, the Household Income Labour Dynamics in Australia sample, which is a longitudinal study run by the Melbourne Institute. And over half of our households identified as being in financial stress, with an average financial stress score of 2.6. So this was markedly higher than the average HILDA score. Around 1 in 3 of our respondents were unable to heat their home due to a shortage of money in the past year. And this was significantly more likely amongst young people and renters. 4 out of 10 couldn't heat their home or had gone without meals due to a shortage of money. And you can see that this compares, this is a marked difference from the Infrastructure Victoria survey. As Damien mentioned, it was really the accounts of energy hardship that were extremely moving from our focus group participants. So people were living in thermally uncomfortable, energy inefficient housing, but putting up with this because the rent was relatively affordable. And as Damien mentioned, people just lying there saying, both of us, and that's the dog and the woman that we spoke to, both of us just lying there in the summer going, I can't do anything, I can't move, it's just not good. And she also mentioned that she was using the dog as well in winter to be able to stay warm. People are also talking about how as they get older, they can't bear the conditions of energy inefficiency and cold. And I think it's really important to think about this phenomenon in terms of the life course, in terms of aging and health. There are women going without heating once the kids have left home and enduring discomfort because they can't afford gas heating. At the age I am now, I cannot stand having to wrap up in the doona. I encourage the dog to get underneath the doona to help me stay warm. Sorry, that was the other one. So it's really important to underline that there was strong support for the transition away from gas. Despite the experiences of disadvantage that we've talked about, over 2/3 of our samples supported the transition. It was more likely with higher levels of education and less likely where they had a preference for gas. There was a reasonably strong preference for gas over electricity, particularly for cooking and hot water. But this was mainly because of the perceived speed, ease, and flexibility of cooking with gas. But few of our participants had experience of induction stoves. In fact, we found ourselves explaining to some of the focus group participants what induction was and how it worked. The preferences for gas or electric appliances were strongly linked to their existing usage. So as an example, a preference for gas heating was expressed by 40% of the households using some form of gas heating, compared to only 18% of those using electric heating. So this suggests that the experience of using electricity for heating may lower the attachment to gas heating. Positive perceptions for gas were less marked in our group than in the general population. Addressing performance and reliability concerns around gas appliances will be really important in convincing people to switch. So just unpacking these perceived benefits a bit more, there was considerable uncertainty about the relevant benefits of electric versus gas appliances. So you can see the dark blue, which is I don't know. Only 28% of our survey respondents thought that electricity had cheaper running costs, as I mentioned earlier, than gas. And there was a significant amount who thought gas was cheaper or the same or didn't know. Almost half didn't know which was cheaper to buy and install. So there's a lot of work to be done convincing people that electricity performs as well as gas for heating and cooking, but there's also the need for good communication and robust evidence to back that up. Around 1 in 10 households had replaced gas appliances with electric ones within the past 5 years, suggesting that there's a lot of support in principle for the transition, but it's not being realised in practice. Amongst this small group, there were no significant variations by individual or household factors, and the 2 most common reasons for switching, unsurprisingly, were lower running costs and environmental concern. For those who hadn't replaced their appliances, tenure, so being a renter, and the cost of replacing appliances were the major barriers. Solar households were more likely to switch. There were twice as many surveyed households with solar panels as without solar panels. Sorry, twice as many surveyed households with solar panels as without had replaced gas appliances with electric ones in the past 5 years, and 1 in 5 of our respondents had solar. So having solar panels is significantly linked to an ambition to replace gas appliances into the future. Knowledge about support programs differed depending on whether the support was for energy bills or subsidies to electrify. So government support programs designed to address affordability had a high degree of awareness, think the power saving bonus or energy concessions. But in contrast, there was a lower awareness and an even lower uptake of the government programs specifically designed to support electrification. And as I mentioned before, only 1 in 3 had heard of the 2 key programs. There was higher awareness of the solar homes program, particularly amongst men, those over 60 years of age and those living in their own home and those not experiencing energy hardship. For the solar homes program, awareness by homeowners was twice as high and uptake 3 times as high compared to renters. Information about how to electrify was more highly sought after by people who spoke a language other than English at home, and support for grants to improve energy efficiency and lower energy bills were favoured by those very conscious of limiting their energy use. In focus groups, we delved a bit deeper with renters who had a direct and positive relationship with their landlord. And they were more likely to see the potential in the solar homes program than those who didn't have that kind of relationship or had no relationship at all. But despite some positive views about the scheme, most of the renters were deterred by the challenge of coordinating with multiple entities and the sheer expense for them in terms of that upfront cost, even though it is smeared over a number of years with the solar homes program. Environmental motivations were a strong driver, but achieving those was very much constrained by financial resources. The other thing that was important here was that trust was a significant barrier. There were heightened perceptions of risk due to a lack of a safety net should things go wrong. So there were people saying, if I make a mistake, I don't have the resources, being on a pension to wear that. There was also a sense of a lack of agency and disempowerment. And you can see the quote from a social housing resident here. When I don't have a say in the decisions, why worry about it? I had no idea. We did detail these customer journeys because they are, for many people, it's a multi-year process and you have to make a series of small to large technology appliance decisions. So I'm just going to draw out one of the customer journeys, and just to note that Diego is a pseudonym. So you can see the enabling factors in green and the barriers in red. So Diego was very environmentally motivated. He called himself a forever renter. He was a bit older on a pension, and he had he was on good terms with his landlord, but he really had a lot of concerns around affordability. His customer journey towards electrification should have begun with the breakdown of a gas heater, but both he and his landlord were unaware of the benefits and supports to electrify. So he himself lacked the agency to make a decision, and the heater took a long time to be replaced. And then one day it was just installed without consultation. So they lived through a winter in Werribee without adequate heating. So Diego is the type of renter who's interested in electrifying, but the sequencing of events, the information provision, and the lack of requirements or standards led to gas lock-in for him. How am I going for time again? Okay. I might just skip this slide then. So I just want to make one point about this slide, that we can't just generalize and assume that there's one type of lower income household and everybody suffers from a lack of financial resources, and that's the summary of the problem. There is variation in what we describe as both interest and capacity to electrify, and we've developed a typology that I can perhaps talk more about if there are questions, that gives you a sense of who falls into the different quadrants of interest and capacity. So to summarize, there's widespread support for transition. But people are not realizing that principled support through action. There are a number of barriers that we've talked about: upfront costs, rental status, and also misunderstandings about the benefit of electric versus gas appliances. There's a low awareness of current programs to enable electrification, but there is a strong support amongst the people we talked to and surveyed for subsidies to lower both energy costs, but also to improve energy efficiency and to really to be able to incentivize landlords to upgrade appliances. And I think there's a very strong call for these voices to be heard in the policy development and planning process. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and everyone online as well. I'd just like to join with Sangeeta and thank our funders, Energy Consumers Australia, the Live Course Centre and the Melbourne Energy Institute as well. And also thank Professor Payne and Travis for launching the report today, as well as my co-authors Sangeeta, Julia and David, and also our editor at the Brotherhood of St. Laurence, Deborah Patterson, who does a wonderful job, and Emma Chessel, who worked on the primary gas project that this is part of, the larger gas project. And there are a team of people involved in the launch today as well. Kate, Danielle, Bridie, Chris, Dennis, and Emma, who have done a great job. So thank you all for that. So I'm just going to run through some of the policy implications we identified, and many of which have been mentioned. And we group them in terms of multiple stresses, information and knowledge, tenure and control, capital and finance, solar and energy efficiency, and also inclusive planning processes. The first one has come through quite strongly is around the multiple stresses these households faced. That all of the households were in some form of energy stress, and the challenges of the inadequate and unaffordable housing were really faced quite strongly by some of the households in the group, as Sangeeta mentioned, and insufficient income as well. And we need to address these issues for themselves, but also there'll be a barrier to the transition if they aren't addressed as well. So the sort of multiple stresses that the people in this group face need to be addressed. Information and knowledge came through very strongly as a theme. So that point that support for electrification is relatively high, but awareness of support services was relatively low, that Sangeeta's just mentioned. And one of the solutions we would see for this is around co-designed and better targeted information and advice, particularly for those who speak a language other than English. Lower income households may be deterred by the perceived risks of electrification as well. And Sangeeta mentioned some of the risks in terms of the unknowns of changing, the fear possible upgrade will lead to rent increases. Also fear unknowns about new appliances like heat pumps that people aren't very familiar with for hot water. So we need to address those issues. We also need to address the structural barriers such as split incentives for renters through things like that we talked about, mandatory standards for rental properties and connecting electrification in there as well. And providing tailored financial support and information that acknowledges those diverse household experiences that Sangeeta talked about. And to go more into this, this theme around trusted and tailored advice came through very strongly as well. And it came up directly from the participants, the idea of a one-stop shop. And again, we've linked that to thinking about the role that the SEC could play as one of our participants, I think it was Deb mentioned before on the video. Ensuring co-design And more evidence, as Sangeetha said, about the benefits of electric over gas, particularly when your people are trying to balance up the upfront cost with the life cycle costs of a particular item as well. People need really clear information. The role of plumbers and other trades came through quite strongly, as did the role around Bunnings and in stores like this where people buy appliances, and the need for training for those plumbers, which is already starting to happen, but the need to expand that out for plumbers, electricians and the like, about new alternatives like e-pumps and also around appropriate heating and cooling. And also it was identified that building energy literacy has a role to play in some households as well. As I mentioned earlier, a plan for the future of the residential gas network will also help to build trust and certainty for households. People need to know what's coming and be certain about that. And Victoria is leading the way in this regard with the roadmap, and they're doing another iteration, as the Minister said, but we would like to see those plans across the board at a federal level and across all states with gas in the residential sector. And we'd also like to see government step in and ensure further investment in the residential gas network does not lock in future vulnerability. If we're still expanding the gas network, that's going to lock in vulnerability for future consumers as well. As has been mentioned a number of times, tenure and control came through very strongly in the work. And so a specific strategy to support renters and rental properties to electrify is really important in this regard. And we would very much link that around standards for energy, mandatory standards for energy efficiency and electrification. But there needs to be measures to ensure that there aren't rental increases associated with that. The participants were worried about the possibility of rental increases associated with upgrades. And more investment is needed to transform community and public housing to be electric and energy efficient as well. Capital and finance came through strongly, as it did in the video there before, in terms of addressing capital barriers. So appropriately targeted grants and rebates are needed, and low and no interest loans have a role to play as well for certain households. And this, as Sangeetha mentioned, would differ depending on the capacity and the interest of different households in what might be the most useful and appropriate mechanism. Another thing that came through was around rooftop solar and just the imbalance in access to rooftop solar, that landlords have quite a lot of access and we want to ensure that keeps expanding, but the challenges for renters to get access to rooftop solar and the importance, the kind of linchpin that rooftop solar plays for many households in electrification and how important it is to open up that access to rooftop solar. And the connection to energy efficiency upgrades, that by doing electrification and energy efficiency together, we can certainly get bigger savings and reduce costs for households as well. So we need to connect them up and integrate them. And finally, was around the inclusive planning processes, which we mentioned earlier as well, and the importance of bringing all voices into the conversation, particularly the sort of voices that we were talking to as part of this work here. And we certainly would see that industry has a role to play, but we would caution a little bit in terms of relying too much on industry and the role that government has to play in terms of bringing in a diversity of voices and ensuring that the different voices are heard. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. If I can invite you guys off, and then I think we're going to move the left. As soon as we're done, there is morning tea. So we're going to go through for a few questions. I have some online. And then I have some of my own. So I'm going to start first with one of the online questions before I get to some of my own. Was there anything surprising in your analysis and your research that struck you?
I was surprised by the enthusiasm, particularly the environmental motivation of the households who face these significant barriers to electrifying. So that high level of support, half the people strongly supported the transition to gas, was great to see. And we really heard it in focus group discussions as well. But then it was also really hard to hear about how many barriers they face to be able to make that switch. But I think we can take heart that these groups, these households who have the hardest, face the greatest struggle to electrify and the support of the transition.
And I would agree with that. And I mean, I was surprised in the individual level, the connection many of the households had to the Brotherhood of St. Laurence. We've worked with these households over many years, but it was the first time we had talked to them as a group. And you could really see a connection to the organisation, the trust in organisations like the Brotherhood, but they also mentioned local councils and other not-for-profits as well. And that strong level of trust and gratitude about support over time, whether that was information and advice or involvement in various programs and services.
Just mentioned, we spoke to a group of Burmese migrants who had a really strong attachment to gas cooking. And they talked about this as both a cultural practice and also about the quality of the food. But they were still very willing to make the switch away from gas for cooking, both for environmental reasons, to do the right thing and also to reduce costs.
So I know you kind of glossed over fairly quickly on the your classification of households and the implications around the information as well as the interest of dwellings to change. Can you expand just a little bit more on those classifications and why do you think understanding these two dimensions is critical for the transition?
Yeah. So the two dimensions were their level of interest in switching and also their capacity, their ability to switch. Interest is really important because if people are interested, if you reduce the barriers and create the enablers, then the switch is able to happen. So then it brings you to all these questions around capacity. I think the classification is important because you can see in that bottom left quadrant where people have low interest and low capacity, they're really going to need the most help to be able to switch. And renters seem to be populating that lower quadrant. But also people who have multiple stressors, as Damien described. So if energy is one, but they're also potentially facing health issues as well as multiple living challenges. And I think one thing that was really important in this research was for us to see that this is not just an energy problem. This is an energy problem, it's a housing policy problem, and it also relates to health because there are so many benefits from improving energy efficiency for people with poor health. So I think that the typology is useful for thinking particularly about the types of assistance that are needed, how to target it, and the intensity of assistance that is needed for different quadrants.
And just to add a little bit to that, I think it's also in terms of the urgency and the costs involved in this transition, that then becomes very important about how government funding and government resources are targeted as well. So I think it's critical that that happens.
I'm going to ask one more question and then I'm going to the audience for questions. So if I understand things correctly, the underlying assumption is that Australia needs to transition as a whole. We need to transition to electrification and that this becomes a Holocaust issue. But the challenge is, if we think of the housing, we have homeowners, right? We have landlords who are private. We also have public or nonprofit housing. So we have a few players in the households that are saying, I can make a difference. I can change to electrification. And then add into that, while we're transitioning, the costs of those who have not transitioned are likely to go up because of the fixed costs around gas. So to what extent is this an issue of we need to speed up the transition across all households versus we need to, the acceleration is already there. But what we need to do is make sure that we're bringing along low-income households and those who may be more economically challenged. Do you have a sense of that? I'm taking you a little bit beyond your report.
So this is indeed a whole economy challenge. I think there is an equity issue around who bears the burden of this challenge, and there's a discussion to be had about, well, why should the lowest income households be bearing this burden when there are businesses in the industry that are probably not doing the heavy lifting that they should. I'll put that to one side because I see this very much as an opportunity to address energy affordability first, and there is the co-benefit of emissions reduction for these households. But if we can help them to make the switch and reduce their energy bills in the medium to long term as well, then I think that's a very important step to take to addressing disadvantage and energy hardship and all of the co-benefits that come with improving the quality of and the cost of electricity.
And I think for us, it's very much that they probably both need to happen at the same time, like we need them both to happen. But we certainly don't want to be in a position where lower income households are bearing those additional costs of the gas network at fixed cost, which that was referred to as the debt spiral. It's quite possible that as more people, particularly with means, exit the gas network, that those remain on the network to be more the network, and that if that is renters and lower income households, that will be very equitable. So that's a challenge that we need to make sure that that's keeping pace with others exiting the network. And of course, those co-benefits that Sangeeta mentioned as well.
Are there questions in the audience? Yes, I'll start first with the man on. Sorry.
Well, look, I understand that you want the low-income households involved in the process. Do you have any ideas about how you do that?
So I think this research was an early attempt to try and canvass those perspectives and obviously trying to translate this through to decision makers. I'm no longer in policy, so as a researcher, we focused a lot on the message we were getting about local scale information, but also for those trusted local organisations to be able to translate the needs and concerns of these households to key decision makers. And as I mentioned, local government came up as a very important scale, both for action, but also for translating the challenges, as did neighbourhood houses, for people who spoke a language other than English, ethnic groups and their state representative groups, I think also have an important voice in this. So I think it is about listening locally, but also looking at the representative groups for these households with their different interests and finding ways of convening forums where their views can be heard in the planning process and hopefully in this new iteration against substitution roadmap.
And I think some of the sort of deliberate democratic forums, like utilising sort of democracy forums where people come together and discuss the issues, the knowledge, the information is presented, the options and the costs involved at that local level would be quite interesting to do. We really thought that there was a change in people's views through the focus groups in terms of some people who had really strong views on the topic, that as information was revealed, they would move their positions slightly as they understood more about it. So I think exploring the opportunities, sort of safe delivery forum will be very interesting as well.
Hi, Diego's story was very interesting to me because it really points out the problem of missed opportunities. So here you had a guy who was interested, but things break when they break. And when they break, gas heaters don't break in summer, they break in the winter. You need one right away. When your gas water heater breaks, you've got no hot water, there's water has spilled out everywhere, and you need something quick. So we've got a situation now where awareness is fairly low. There's lots of barriers. But when something like Diego's replacement happens, you've got 10 years of more gas because people don't change out an appliance that's 2 years old. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas about programs or policies that can deliver the interest, the support, and all of those enablers that you need at the time when something breaks, because that's when the decision, a 10-year decision is made. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Lance. I think certainly one of the issues is around the training of plumbers and electricians and others. So the training of the trades and the accredited training, I think, is essential to upskill the various trades so that they've got more awareness of the longer term cost. This is where we would also see a role for rebates and subsidies for time of replacement, and they don't have to be quite as large as if you're trying to get somebody to do an upgrade off the bat of an existing appliance, but where we have subsidies in place that are well targeted towards those on lower incomes and encouraging people to make better choices about those upgrades that will save them money in the long run. At the time of replacement, I think that's critical as well. We have seen some in that regard. I think one of the issues with the programs that come up and came through the data that Sangeeta presented is that they tend to be quite stop-start. And so they'll happen for a couple of years and then they'll be gone. And many people just don't become aware of them sufficiently. So what we need is some programs that last for a longer period of time, have longevity in the market, and people become familiar with. So when their hot water system does break down or their heater does, they can replace it. We do have some, like in Victoria, there's the China Energy Upgrade program. The level of incentive probably isn't sufficient for some of the households we work with in terms of to really facilitate that change, but there are opportunities there to build on that.
So there's a question here, and then I also have an online question. So I'm going to first start with the online question. But on the point, because you actually I'm going to ask, you said something about the importance of providing better incentives for low-income households. But some of these low-income households have landlords, right? So that's going to be the tricky part of how do you balance the incentives so that where it's supporting low-income households, regardless of whether they're the home or okay, that's coming. The online question was: did you notice differences in attitudes between participants who live in strata versus standalone homes?
We actually didn't have, well, we had people living in social housing, which, but we didn't actually have many people living in strata titles. I did go back and check this the other day. They were mainly people living in standalone homes, so I don't think we had a sample size to be able to talk about that with any significance.
There's a question there, and then what I'm going to suggest is if you ask a question and then you also had a question, so we'll do two together.
Thank you. Tristan, just wanted to ask about the role of rent as something to identify and report that some people feel like they can't move because of the rent that they're currently paying. I would put it to the forum that rent is an incomplete measure of your operating cost of running your house, given that the gas substitution work now caused about $1,000 difference per year between an electric home and gas home. So how can we improve the visibility to those making decisions on whether to consider operating costs as well as the headline about your activity.
You're absolutely right. It is very tricky in the current rental market, and we certainly heard from a number of people who were, as I mentioned before, in precarious housing circumstance, who, for them, you know, the energy efficiency of the dwelling wasn't even on the radar compared to getting into a house that was affordable to live in, that they could stay safely. And I'm thinking of one person in particular that could stay safely with a 6-year-old child as well. So I think, unfortunately, due to the current rental circumstances, there's a lot of people really struggling. Our approach would be, and this is the role of St. Laurence, would be to say that we need the mandatory minimum standards as a basic measure. So we've got a base for all properties meet a certain minimum standard of energy efficiency, and electrification should be included in that. And then following that, then disclosure, mandatory disclosure would make sense as well, but we would like to see that minimum standard in place first, and mandatory disclosure would allow people to compare the efficiency of different properties. But we do recognise for many people at the very bottom of the housing market that that's not the choice that they'll be making based on them getting a home that's affordable for them, unfortunately.
Sorry, just on the sequencing that absolutely in support of minimum standards, but I put it to you that minimum standards take 10 years. Even if you legislate it today, so why not go with disclosure first, and then work on minimum standards as soon as you can? But just acknowledging it's a large stock to get.
Yeah, it's something to discuss. I mean, I think if you look at the history of mandatory disclosure, that's probably taken a long time in Australia as well. So both of them have merit, I think. So.
The only thing I add is that rent is a cost, that decision around housing is about location, and then it is the neighbourhood of the schools that your kids go to. So that kind of economic calculation always has to be contextualised by those other attachments.
So I'm going to comment on it, even though I didn't write this report. I think you have a point, because if you think that part of the solution are the landlords having to disclose, here's the rent, here's the average income, is going to create an incentive for landlords to change their decisions around electrification. So you're using it as another resource, not the only. Your point is that you want to have standards, but you also need other resources to encourage change in behavior.
Thank you. My question is very close to this. I was just interested by your last point on the solar page that mentioned creative financial investments. And I was just piqued by that, whether that refers to private industry and whether you're looking at incentivising investment into solar or energy efficiency rebates beyond government subsidies.
Yeah, so look, I think that there are some interesting ideas out there about how we can get landlords, particularly private landlords, to place rooftop solar on their properties and have that owned sometimes by third parties who might recruit some costs from the landlord where it's not owned by the landlords. It's something I think that because of the scale of this problem in relation to landlords and how difficult it has been to address, we need to have all options on the table. So that's one where we certainly didn't have a solution for, but I think we need to open our thinking up to things like mandatory disclosure, but also the other financing options that might be out there. We do have a slightly unique, I think, or at least different rental market to many countries where you do have a lot of owners or investors who own one or two properties, so that disaggregation of ownership makes it a little bit more tricky than some other areas where you've got lots of large institutional landlords. So I think we need to open up to all possible solutions.
Okay, so I'm going to do 2 more questions, but hang on. One is online, and I think this is really important in terms of thinking about next steps. This is from Joe Armstrong at Climate Works. Her question is, as it is a national issue, but the power to address energy efficiency in both new builds and existing homes rests with states and territories. what approaches are we calling the federal government to do, or should the advocacy be more focused on states and territories?
I think we would see a real role for federal government in putting some more money on the table. So I think the states have limited access to finances, and the federal government should be working with the states and supporting the efforts that the states have really championed and put more money on the table. Developing up frameworks, there's work around a framework of mandatory standards for rental properties federally to get coherence across different states is also welcome. I think there's probably a lot that could be done in that regards. And in relation to things like mandatory disclosure, there's work that the federal government could be doing as well. So we would see this both. We need this to happen at both a state and federal level. And we would definitely see an opportunity at a federal level at the moment to, alongside the National Energy Performance Strategy around energy efficiency, to bring in electrification into that work as well.
Okay, we're going to do, I know there's lots more questions in the room as well as online, but we're going to do one more question. And then for those of you who are physically here, we do have morning tea, and so you'll be able to continue to ask questions and engage in a conversation. So last question.
Thank you. I'm interested to hear the panel's opinions around moving to program design, and in an ideal world, who would be doing what in an implementation in regards to the opportunity presented for these low-income households. And let's take a Victorian example in terms of the context, because that's what we found this morning, but I'm also keen to hear on who would play what role in the various different elements of a program that would respond to the opportunities, some of the barriers that you presented. So.
Look, I think it's probably a number of different programs that are needed. So we would see that there's a role for programs like, there was a recent program here in Victoria, the home heating and cooling upgrade program, which was a subsidy for lower income households to install efficient heating and cooling in terms of reverse cycle air conditioners. And in that regard, it was a program run by government and suppliers who would do the installation and delivery, and there was no that program for not-for-profits or others. We've seen it quite reasonable. In other cases, you might have not-for-profit organisations like the Unitings of the world, or Brotherhood or others, who could play a more direct role with some of those households with much more limited capacity. And we also think that there's the potential to look at the one-stop shop type idea. We've referred to it as around trusted information and advice, but when you look at it internationally, it's also been done somewhat differently. So for instance, in Ireland, they have a scheme where you can go to the one-stop shop and they will help you to project manage a whole upgrade of your home. So you would basically go to them and they will assist you through the whole process of the upgrade. And that then takes away a lot of the worry and also assist with finance as well. So I think there's probably a number of different programs that are needed, and there'll be different actors in terms of providing that support in government, in the private sector, and in the not-for-profit world as well.
Okay. Let me thank Sangeeta, Damien, and your co-authors on creating such a very fascinating and deep and thought-provoking report. So thank you. We thank Travis and Brotherhood of St. Laurence for being a part of this project and this launch, as well as we should be thanking the Life Course Center, the Center of Excellence at University of Melbourne for being able to enable this kind. And thank you, audience, both online as well as those of you who are here today for coming for this launch and making it successful. My hope for everyone here is that you're going to take these findings and say, how do we implement? How do we move forward? How do we encourage a faster and efficient transition? Thank you.